So welcome everybody, welcome to this final edition of Beyond Discipline for 2016-2017, the academic year. I want to apologize, I will read some of my remarks because I just finished my last course like 15 minutes ago, so it's the best I can do, but we're committed. So my name is Mireille Paquet, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science here. And tonight we will explore the influence of art on research under the theme Show and Tell. So 4 faculty from different academic disciplines will present how art has contributed to the research in ways that range from inspiration, concept building, methodology, as well as knowledge transfer and dissemination. So the way arts affect us can be really multiple, and we were really interested in getting some artists, but also non-artists, to talk to us about how it affects them. So we're lucky to have with us tonight André, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science, but tonight, first and foremost, a geographer, right? Then we have Stephen Kawai, who is a chemist and a visual artist. We have Carly Daniel-Hughes, who's Associate Professor from the Department of Religion and Culture, as well as Rebecca Duclos, Dean of the Faculty of Fine Arts, Prof of Art History, Curator Extraordinaire, as well as a podcast finder. Now we've just learned, so it's great. The theme of the event actually stems from a discussion I had with Dean Roy last year. So as any good tenure track faculty, I'm always trying to get some attention to my research, right? And so I met Dean Roy and I was like, I should tell him I have published a book. So I jumped on the occasion, and at an event, I talked to him about my newly published book that I had published in the spring last year. And we spoke about the book cover. I gave him a copy, and he actually commented that he liked the book cover, and I was like, oh yeah, I don't. So I disclosed to him that I was very sad about not having been allowed to use the image of my dream on the cover. And that is the image of my dream. That is what I wanted on the cover. It is a painting by Jean-Paul Lemieux, who's a really important Canadian painter from modern Canadian painter, but also like my favorite painter of all time. This painting is called Le Visiteur du Soir, and it really represents the kind of lines that Lemieux provides in his work, the kind of colors as well. My publisher, who's they're a good publishing house, but they had no interest, or I shall translate that in no money, in providing me with this book cover. So we had to pay fees and all of that. But they were not interested in hearing how the work of Lemieux was really interestingly linked to my understanding of Canada, because I work mostly on Canada, and to me, Lemieux really talks about Canadian reality, and how it was a source of inspiration for my book. It's a manuscript where I explore how large empty spaces, in that case it's provinces, and here we can think of the prairie provinces or parts of Quebec as well, how these empty spaces attempt to attract international migrants. And in my book, I also hint at how these migrants, like the Visiteur du Soir, end up isolated as almost atomized agent in these new homes, in these places that are new immigrant destination, and often they're the only ones standing, right? So to me, the painting was perfect. The publisher was just not that interested. So Lemieux's anxiety about social transformation of rural societies, his translation of the vastness of Canada, and on a more personal level, his representation of the natural lights in different parts of the country have all been extremely important for my understanding of the geography of Canada and the political diversity of Canada as well. And so despite my dream of Lemieux, of a Lemieux painting to ornate my book cover, I still use the images of Lemieux in my research as source of inspiration, but also in my teaching. And that's how I want to close. So this is another painting from Lemieux. It's called Charlottetown Revisited. And I teach a lot of Canadian politics, and I teach provincial politics. This painter, to me, captures vividly 2 of the most important features of the Canadian Confederation of 1867. By the way, it's Canada 150, so that's what we're trying to get excited about. But as I try to show to my students, nobody was kind of really excited about it, right? So the first feature, no, but it's important, right? So the first feature is that Confederation was an elite-driven process, right? So you have those like old men, like that are very like, Solonel, probably like very much taller than everybody. And then you also have the fact that nobody seems very pleased, right? So there was this lackluster kind of engagement is this legislative union that led to our current constitution or part of our current constitution. So this year, for the first time, I used that in my class where I tried to explain that to my student. And for the first year, my students really got it. They're like, this doesn't sound like a lot of fun. This doesn't look like a lot of fun. So I guess nobody was cheering about the creation of Canada. And to me, from there, this is not a criticism about Canada. It's just a translation of the political history. This really helps me understand or explain to them what then led to the current dynamics we have in our country. So I could speak about Jean-Paul Lemieux and his work for hours, so I'll stop. But I will now invite Dean Roy to show and tell how his research has been influenced by art, and then we'll move to the other participants. So welcome, have fun.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Welcome to Beyond Disciplines. And tonight I'm not here as a dean, I'm here as a professor of geography, as Mireille has highlighted. And as a professor of geography, I'm interested in rivers. I've been interested in rivers mostly from the starting point of networks. So if you look at my, God forbid you do, if you look at my doctoral dissertation, right, it was about the optimality principle as it applies to networks. And I compared in there the lung, the pulmonary artery, and rivers. Why? They're all branching networks and they transport fluid, or their transport mechanism, right? And the physics of it interested me. But then when I came to Montreal to become a professor, nobody was interested in pulmonary artery, nor in the lungs. So I focused on rivers. And the thing that interested me in rivers the most was the fluid flow and the turbulence of it. And turbulence means that the fluid flow is unstable, unpredictable, yet may contain some structures. When we talk about a turbulent kid, what are we saying? We're saying a kid that has lots of energy, dissipates it in all kinds of ways that we don't predict, and is a bit annoying. And sometimes turbulence is interpreted as negative. It's like a negative thing. You know, we hear a lot about living in turbulent times. Is that good? Usually not. But the fact is, though, that turbulence is essential for life. It's essential in terms of the physical phenomenon that actually allows nature to work, and us in nature to work. So one thing that you might want to know is where turbulence comes from. What's the origin of turbulence? It's interesting that the origin of turbulence has nothing to do with fluid flow. It had something to do with people. The root of turbulence is turba, which means crowd in Latin. It's really interesting that crowd in Latin actually conveyed this idea of unpredictable behavior. The sort of sense that you get people together, you don't quite know what will happen. So I'm not sure what will happen tonight, because we're a crowd and we're quite densely packed, right? But turba is at the essence of many, many different words, and turbulence is one of them. And it became a word that actually is translating this instability, this unpredictability of behavior, right? It's also interesting if you ask people from Japan how, if there's a word in their language, and I've been sort of probing this, I'm not sure if it's true, it's anecdotal. And the word for turbulence in Japanese is also turbulence. So there's this connotation about turbulence, how it is. Now, one of the things about turbulence and turbulence fluid flow, and the flow in those pictures is flowing from right to left, is that it's unpredictable, but it also generates structures. So coming back to art, if you think of the top figure, which is coming from a flume experiment, where you inject dye, you look at those vortices and convoluted things, and they're aesthetic. They convey lots of what art is in turbulence. The one at the bottom is a picture of mine taken in a natural setting. You have two fluid mixing. One of them is turbid and one of them is clear. And what you do see is that you see some of those eddies taking place in the turbulence of the flow. Right. Now, this is where the story gets to be somewhat of the storytelling. So I have two pieces of art. Right? The first piece of art is not this one. This is just to illustrate how turbulence can be beautiful. But the first piece of art is this one. I think you all know what it is. You know the painter. You know where it's coming from. Right. So you could see that turbulence generates those vortices, those nicely structured things. They swirl around. But then one day I was reading something, and then an article popped up from a colleague from Mexico. His name is Aragon, and colleagues from the UK. And what he did is basically they scanned this picture, and they did analysis of the brightness. So they take small pixels, right, a little pixel in the thing, and they compare the pixel with the pixel next to it, and pixel second next to it, second next to it, third next to it, fourth next to it, and so on. And you do this analysis. I wonder why they thought of this, all right? But I'll tell you why they thought of this. They did the analysis. It's quantitative analysis. And when you do this and you plot the distance between pixels and the response of pixels and measure like the difference between them, and you plot this up, you get very nice little curves. And you compare these curves to one of the most famous model of turbulence, which comes from the famous mathematician and physician Kolmogorov in the 40s, and actually, they plot exactly the same. So they concluded that Van Gogh, in the time when he was very unsettled, his mind actually could recreate turbulence as a signature. It's quite a statement, right? The article has been published in the Physics of Fluid, so you know. Really interesting. Now, that was picked up by Nature, was picked up by so many things, because the analogy between an unstable mind and the ability to reproduce turbulence was caught. And they've done this with quite a few of Van Gogh's pictures, paintings. Some of them were suppressed, as you know. Right? That's one, but he's done others. Wheat fields, all of that period, they all show the turbulence signature. And then you take out of that period, they don't show it. Now, I was so impressed by that because it's a connection between art. So two things happened. I was at the time on a fellowship at Cambridge working on a book that was to be called Turbulence as a Metaphor. So I get the article, and coincidentally, in The Guardian on a Sunday, I open it up, and there it is, the Starry Night is being sort of exhibited in Amsterdam. So what do? I'm on sabbatical. I book a plane from Stansted Airport, and I go to Amsterdam. And you in front of this, and you just don't think about the turbulence, you think about the genius. But as a scientist who knows about turbulence, I'm so fascinated how Van Gogh could reproduce the turbulence in there. It's like an inner knowledge of turbulence. I was very inspired by this. At the same time, I've written to the other guy. I said, Dr. Aragon, I always thought that the one who captured turbulence the best was William Turner. He said, André, we've tried it. Doesn't work. The only one where it worked was Van Gogh. So my own image of turbulence from the Turner's painting turned out not to be the turbulence. It turned out to be something else. It looks like it. And I won't picture it tonight, but they're fantastic images of Turner that actually have this turbulent feel in it. And one of the nice things about this turbulence is not just about the luminescence and the brightness of pixels, it's also about the movement. One thing you can see, this is a still picture, but we can imagine the movement in it. And this is another thing about turbulence. Turbulence never stands still, even in a still. And that is also some kind of an amazing feat for a painter to capture that. Right, so this is a story about that piece of art, and I know I don't have much time to conclude, but I'll conclude with a quote. A quote from William Faulkner in his novel, As I Lay Dying. I won't tell the story, but at one point they're carrying something and they need to go across a river. Anyone has read As I Lay Dying? It's a really sort of story. But then, as they go across the river, Darrell, who actually basically never speaks, but it's in his mind, reflects on the river itself. And the quote goes like this: "Before us, the thick, dark current runs. It talks up to us in a murmur, becomes ceaseless and myriad. The yellow surface dimpled monstrously into fading swirls, traveling along the surface for an instant, silent, impermanent, and profoundly significant. As though just beneath the surface, something huge and alive waked for a moment of lazy alertness out of and into light slumber again." This is, I think, the most beautiful description of what turbulence is. All the key words: silent, impermanent, profound, making a change, the concept of swirls. Right. I happened to meet one of the top scholars in North America about Faulkner. He was coming from the University of Mississippi. I was invited to dinner. He happened to be there. Great discussion. I said, you know what? I think Faulkner has probably the best description I've ever read of turbulence. He said, you know, Faulkner was that kind of inquisitive mind. He might have studied turbulence at one point or another, because he was always curious about things. And one story that shows this curious kind of behavior, when he was in elementary school, there were about 300 kids being photographed, and there was a rotating camera. I believe Faulkner was about 7, 8 years old. So Faulkner stood at one end, ran in the back, came to the other end, and he's the only kid photographed twice. Sort of this story illustrating how Faulkner might have been a curious mind inquisiting about what it is about the phenomenon that when you go through a river, not just about the poetry of it, which is significant and deep, but also about the physical phenomena. So this is how the interplay of art and turbulence in my mind works. And it's that kind of story that I wanted to tell tonight. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Dean Waugh for inviting me to this event, as unlike the other presenters who are all professors and deans, I'm really a nobody here. So I'm getting funny. Use the microphone. Okay. Yeah. Anyway, just want to make sure. Okay, until now, or I guess most of the talks today are addressing these key questions in the context of a particular piece of art or a particular research project. I want to attack it a bit differently in that I want to sort of go through my experience of having an art practice and being a scientific researcher over decades. So the time scale here is very different. So I'm a visual artist, as I was introduced, and probably what I make the most are mobiles. And I think most people here know what a mobile is. Calder invented this type of art form in the first half of the 20th century. I made my first mobile in 1980 while I was a SAGEP student, and I have more or less continued making them right to this very day. Obviously, I had to take some breaks because I decided to go get degrees in science. I did my BSc in biochemistry, and I was lucky enough to win an NSERC summer scholarship thingy, which allowed me to do research in a chemistry lab. I started becoming very interested in organic chemistry, and in 1984, I made my first molecule. And when I say I made my first molecule, I mean the first molecule that was never made before, had to be characterized. So, as a young student, I was really excited about, really doing real science. Now, at that point, or for many years after that, I never really saw any connection between my mobile making activity and my studies and then work as a chemist. The mobile making just seemed to be a nice sort of relaxing break from studying and then work, and then I worked for corporations, so at times I really wanted to just get out of the lab and run to the art studio and make mobiles. But a few years ago, I showed a number of pieces, and I was asked a question, and my response was just not accepted by anybody. I'll get back to this a bit later. But when then I started thinking about the relationship between making mobiles and doing chemistry in the lab, and I came to the realization that these two aspects of my life weren't separated at all, but were really, really closely intertwined. And I eventually put some of my thoughts on paper and published them in a journal called Leonardo, so the reference is there. Most of the material in this talk is taken from this article. So since this is show and tell, I take it as an invitation to carry out some blatant self-promotion and present some of the types of art pieces that I make. This is a mobile, which is pretty spare and minimalist. I like these type of pieces. I often make them. Here's another one, probabilities. I actually might show this here at Concordia next month at some event. I was just contacted. These spare pieces are inspired more by an artist named George Rickey, who was also a kinetic artist in the mid-20th century, who actually had a much stronger influence on me than Calder did. But I also like these more playful pieces, colorful ones. This one actually I made for my little boy, and he loves playing with the little figures. But I think most relevant to this talk are pieces like this one shown here, where you have areas that are really quite complex. There are a lot of objects hanging. They're put together in a rather complicated way. I have quite a few pieces over the years that incorporate this level of complexity. Here's one where I use hematite as well as rocks. Rocks often find their way into my mobiles because people really like to see these things, rocks kind of floating around in space. So what exactly is a mobile? Well, if you're an engineer, I think you would describe them as constructs composed of nestled levers. Now, we all know what levers are. They're usually a bar. You hang weights or apply some force to either side, and they will rotate about a fixed point. So here, whether it's a seesaw or a balance scale, that fixed point shown in red is referred to as a fulcrum, right? So I think you could make the connection to a mobile. This is the simplest type of mobile that you can imagine. You just have a bar, you hang two objects, and depending on where you place your fulcrum, that will basically dictate whether the bar is horizontal or inclined or whatever. Now, what I really want to get into, and now I'm really getting into the meat of the presentation, is how one plans out a mobile. Because unlike most art pieces, planning out, or actually making a mobile, is very different. For instance, if you're making a sculpture out of a big slab of granite, right, you're not going to start chiseling away at the eyebrows or the eyelashes, right? You're going to deal with the big swaths and then slowly focus in on the details. However, due to the constraints that are placed on you when you're making a mobile, right, gravity and these little nestled levers, you basically have to do it in a completely different way. You start with the details when you're making them, and this complicates the planning of the mobiles. So I want to go through this planning process, which I suppose is a deconstruction with you. So let's say I have in my head an idea to make this mobile called Leonardo. Where I have the objects, which I have a vision of where they should be in 3 dimensions, and then I have all the objects along the bottom. Now, to plan a mobile, you have to go through this deconstruction process where you take your piece and you just see how you can maybe break it into smaller pieces. And you continue this deconstruction until you get even smaller fragments and so on and so forth, until you're just left with these series of objects that you want to put in your mobile. So when you want to put it together, it's just the opposite, right? You start with all of your objects collected together. And initially, you're probably joining them together, so you're making these little levers, right? You have to determine where you should place the fulcrum so they're balanced. And then these, you then join together, right? So you go up one level in this hierarchy of deconstruction in the opposite sense. Place your fulcra where they should be. Attach them. Now we have these 2 big swaths. Okay, sorry, I got time warning. And finally, if you put the big pieces together, there is your mobile. So I hope you appreciate how you really start with the details and you build up to make the final piece. So this is just another example of one of those more complicated mobiles. Now, a few years ago, I was showing a number of these pieces, and I was asked by a number of people, like, do you actually plan these out? And I go, yeah, sure, it's pretty easy. You just kind of take them apart in your mind, you plan them out. And everybody said, I don't believe that I can actually plan something like this out. Okay, so I actually thought about it, because to me it just seemed very obvious and easy how you do it. And suddenly I realized that this process of mentally deconstructing a mobile is virtually identical to the process that I use at work when I'm trying to plan how to make an organic molecule, right? So this really was a shock to me, okay? It suddenly, things in my life kind of started to make sense, connecting these two very disparate aspects of it, right? Also about this time, I guess around 2004-05, there was a lot of talk about art and science and the art science movement, probably because Dave Edwards had just published his art science book. So I got the book, I read it, I thought about all these things, and that's when I came up with this concept of the coalescence of processes, right? So what I believe was happening was that after a long period of, doing art and science at the same time, a lot of the processes kind of merge, and you find that you're drawing from the same sort of mental way of thinking. And I think to convince you of this, I have to talk about chemistry. Okay, I'll try to make this as simple as possible, but retrosynthesis is a term that refers to how you plan out making an organic molecule, okay? For your purposes, look at the thing on top, okay? And without even knowing any chemistry, each sphere there is an atom. It's all put together to form a molecule. Now, organic chemists are often concerned about making molecules, whether that's the point of the research or because they have to make the molecule to carry out further studies. Now, retrosynthesis is this mental exercise of deconstruction. You take a molecule and you kind of figure out, are there any obvious ways to split it? Okay, in this case there is, because the small piece that got lopped off is something that you can buy and it's easily accessible, so it's an obvious way of disconnecting, making this disconnection within your target molecule. So then the question becomes, with the other bigger piece, how do I make that? So you work backwards. You think of what can I possibly use to make the bigger piece? So now I'm at this structure here, so you're thinking, what simpler molecule can I use to make that? And you keep doing this until you reach a point where you're at a starting material which is practical. In this case, for this particular synthesis, it's menthol, which you can buy buckets of for not too much. It's not a controlled substance. So in the lab, this isn't my work, this is E.J. Corey's work, Nobel laureate. His group took menthol, and then working backwards, step by step, built these intermediates, and finally put those large pieces together and got the target molecule. So I hope you can see that this process of analyzing how to make a molecule and making it is very similar to the process of deconstructing a mobile in the planning phase and then putting it together. So in conclusion, I just want to say in answer to these questions that I believe that over a long period of time, sometimes an artistic practice really can influence scientific practice and vice versa, to the point where in some cases maybe the two processes fuse and actually become one common way of thinking. And obviously if you have this close connection in the processes, there's going to be a lot of crosstalk. For the sake of time, I'm not going to get into the details, but in the end, I started realizing that my mobile building had a big influence on the research I chose to carry out, because in the end, I discovered that mobiles and molecules behave very similar in terms of how they move. And obviously, in the other direction, molecules and other chemistry-related concepts offer a plethora of wonderful sort of imagery that can be used as inspiration to create new mobiles and other art pieces. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your kind attention.
Okay, we're really switching gears here. I'm a historian of antiquity and early Christianity, so we're not going to be talking about science, I can assure you that. Some Latin, though. So for a feminist historiographer, artistic objects provide potentially rich resources for studying women's lives. And more specifically, I'm interested in artistic images or objects that were designed for and used by Roman women in antiquity, because they often present complex rhetorical statements about gender, the body, sexuality, marriage, statements that are very different than what we find in literary sources, which are mostly penned by elite men. So I'm going to take for my example one of my favorite pieces from antiquity, the Projected Casket. This casket was found with a cache of 60 other silver objects rediscovered in the 17th century, now housed in the British Museum. So there were a lot of objects found. I won't talk about the relationship of this casket to those other objects. What we do know is that this was a casket that was owned by, not a funerary casket, it's small. It's for makeup and for an elite woman's toilette. So she was something she would take to the baths. It had lotion, perfumes, and this kind of thing in it. We know something about who owned or used this casket. It might have been designed for her or given to her as a wedding present. And we know that because of the Latin inscription that appears here on the front lid, which tells us Secunda and Projectus live in Christ. And then here on the top of the casket, we see an image of the happy couple surrounded by a tondo and two cherubic figures there on the top of the casket. Now, here is a view of the casket from the back. You can see it's basically two pyramids, rectangles, kind of pyramids. There's a lot of spaces on this piece, and all of it is covered with imagery except for the bottom. So I can't possibly talk about the rich iconographic program here. I can't do justice to the whole thing, but I want to highlight a few things just about what it tells us about women's lives, or what it might tell us that's complicated in terms of what the literary sources have to say about these issues. So first thing is, you'll notice on the top back of this casket, there is a scene here. There's a woman, and she's got some people who are bringing her to another building. These are the deductio sponsa, so it's either a scene where the bride is being taken to her husband's home, or the other interpretation, the one that I favor, actually, is that she's being escorted to the baths. And that these are her attendants that are going to take her to the baths, where she's going to adorn herself, and where she's going to use the items that are in this casket. And the reason I like this reading is because around the bottom of the casket, there are a number of figures. All these figures carry things, objects, towels, slippers, mirrors. The most important figure that appears is the one right here in the center archway, who is supposed to be the woman who owns the casket, so either Projecta herself or just an idealized image of a Roman matron. She's in a high-backed chair. There you can see her up close. She's doing something with her hair, and there you can see an attendant holding some item, maybe a casket or something that she would use at the baths. The iconography of this is similar. We find it in other places. This is from Roman North Africa. This is from a private bath complex, so it would have been on the floor. And here is an image that's very similar to what we find in the Projected Casket. A woman at her toilette, attended by some slaves, and then all of these objects around her that would be used to fashion her in her beauty regime, effectively. Okay. The other thing I should say, I neglected to say on the earlier slide, all of these figures that appear, apart from Projecta, are female, except for there are two male figures who appear on either side, and they're young boys, they're youthful figures, so they're either young slave boys or eunuchs. So this is a very like woman's world, feminine identified kind of world that this object is portraying. Right atop Projecta, there is this scene. This is an image of Venus. She's nude. She sits on a shell. She's surrounded by mythic figures there, centaur tritons, and they're ridden by cherubs. She's looking in a mirror. And what you'll notice, I can go back to that slide a second. What you'll notice that's so interesting, I can't step away so far, is that Projecta and Venus are in a visual line. She's right atop the matron. So we're to equate them. Not only visually are they placed together, but their posture is the same. So the viewer is to see a link between Venus and the matron. And this makes sense because in Roman thinking, Venus was the goddess of love and seduction. She oversaw the arts of the bath and all the things that went on in the bath complex. So she's the logical goddess to feature on this logical to feature on an object that would have been used for women's toilette. But of course, remember, this is a Christian woman, so that's where we get to the complicated piece of all of this. Venus was a very popular goddess to represent oneself as. Some elite women were even had portraits commissioned, or other people commissioned in their honor, portraits of them in the guise of Venus, very explicitly equating them with Venus and her seductive powers. Now, all of these were married women, so the equation here is that, before marriage or as part of marriage comes love and seduction. Okay, so I don't lose my place. So what are the conclusions? So what do I get out of looking at a piece like this? So here we have an exquisite piece of art from a woman's toilette that celebrates beauty and the seductive powers of adornment and would be used in facilitating those very same ends. The box contains the tools by which the matron would accomplish her transformation into a kind of Venus. What makes this artifact so remarkable for me as a scholar of early Christianity is that it was owned by a Christian woman, and it was owned by her at a moment when Christians were increasingly defining themselves as ascetics or ascetically minded. Christians were taking up traditional Roman values of chastity and modesty in marriage, and they were extending them and arguing for full sexual renunciation. And in their arguments, especially the male authors who were insisting that women should be sexually chaste, they often attacked. One of their targets was women's clothing and dress. There are many early Christian treatises about women's clothing. And they're basically saying women should dress modestly, they should let go of makeup, adornment, luxury, all the very things that are being celebrated by this casket that was owned by a married Christian woman. So that tells us on the first hand that the representation or the understanding that Christian women had of adornment could have been very different from what we get from the texts. But I don't want to oversimplify, because this object also is very rhetorically complicated. I would suggest it presents multiple viewing points. On the one hand, it sort of presents a viewing point of a male gaze, right? The women here are objects of erotic desire and lust. You, as a male viewer, you get to gaze in on this private sphere you would never normally see. And all of the artistic energies that are going into the adorning of this woman are done in light of an absent but very much anticipated male viewer, in this case a husband. So he's the audience for all of this production that's happening. But it doesn't just present a male gaze, it also enables a female gaze. Because, as I said, all of the figures that appear here are part of what the Romans called women's world, part of the arts of adornment, and all status and classes of women. We have slave women pictured here with elite women who would have been part of the Roman house and in the female spaces of the house, part of the same spaces, and allows a kind of connection for an insight into the way that they saw their positive role in contributing to adornment. And then finally, of course, the most interesting tension in this whole piece is here we have a piece that celebrates marriage in Christ while also holding up a sex life in Venus in one object. Thank you.
So thanks for the invitation to all of us, to bring all of us together. I as the kind of cleanup crew, I'm going to see if I can weave some threads together, and I think I might be able to do it in the sense of, I just noticed though, can you see that? Not very well, let me see. Oh, there we go, okay. Intuition, improvisation, iteration. I'm going to speak less about the role of art in research and more about the role of the artistic approach or the artistic mind. So it's a little bit of looking at what André was talking about, of what intuitively would have inspired his colleagues to have come to Starry Night and looked at the turbulence patterns. You know, what is it about a kind of intuitive connection that would have brought Stephen to think about his mobiles and his molecules, and also how can objects create a kind of curiosity within us? So this question of how do we know the artist's mind? Can we look at a Da Vinci drawing from the 1500s and try to discern, what he was thinking about the engineering aspects of his flying machine? Can we look at a page, the first, in this case, it's Beethoven's first page of the score of his Fifth Symphony? Can we look at this and try to understand how he was hearing the symphony evolve in his mind? Can we perform that kind of extraction? Or in a more anonymous way, can we look at these notational drawings for a fight score, for a sword duel, and try to discern how the choreographer, how she was seeing the duel sort of play out in her mind. And of course, there's a long history of textual explorations, the fascination with the artist's draft. In this case, this is George Orwell's 1984. Can we look at all of the possible future texts that were never written to try to understand what Orwell was imagining? And then, unlike the archive of the text, is something more ephemeral. This was a really incredible experiment that an Italian photographer in Life magazine did with Pablo Picasso. What you see here is actually, it's a darkened room, and Picasso was given a small electric light and asked to draw in the air, and the shutter was left open on 2 cameras to produce these images. So what you see is a drawing of a centaur. So, a centaur or minotaur. And apparently Picasso was so intrigued with this process of capturing his own drawing, his own thought, while it was emerging, that he sat for 5 photo shoots. So there's a whole series of these beautiful photographs. So again, this idea of how do we even capture the ephemeral notion of a mark or a gesture being made. And then we think about the gestures of bodies in space. This, in particular, is a very interesting way of looking at improv, contact improv, which was made most well known by Nancy Stark Smith and Stephen Paxton. You can see that she's just casually carrying Stephen on her shoulder. These contact improv methods would emerge, performances would last for hours and sometimes even days. And it was half sport, half play, half dance. So again, how do artists who are dancers think with their bodies, draw with their bodies? Other ways that we get to an artist's mind, we talk to them, like Calvin Tompkins did for many, many afternoons with Marcel Duchamp. And these are, sort of unexpurgated, unedited interviews that are absolutely beautiful, and a really beautiful glimpse into Duchamp's mind. We can take a slightly more radical approach in a more dramatic way and stop all this talking and dancing and scoring and actually do what Ted Serios did, and this is to produce a thoughtographic photograph. In the 1960s, Jules Eisenberg did a number of experiments with, this is Ted, who was able to project, they thought, images on film with his mind, with his psychic powers. So the images that you see on the right were produced on Polaroid film purely through Ted's mind. Of course, the jury is still out exactly whether or not they represent his thought processes. Maybe less dramatic would be these kinds of images. These are fMRI scans of a human brain following a very interesting experiment that was done in Germany, where 2 groups of retirees were brought into 2 different situations over 10 weeks. One group was asked to make art and engaged in art-making exercises, very structured, very prolonged, and another group was asked to come into a museum education setting and to look at art and to analyze objects of art. And what you're seeing here is the visual art production group, where participants actively created art, and the cognitive art group, where they were evaluating the art. The scientists were looking at what's called the functional interplay of DMN, or a default mode network, and brain scientists who are in the room will know this much better than I do. But this is where you can actually see brain activity. And did the scientists find it? Yes, they did. I'm not sure where in that they found their answer, but there was a significant improvement in psychological resilience from the pre-intervention to the post-intervention group, but only in the group who made the art, not those who were just talking about it. So all to say, there are many ways that we have continually tried to understand the artist and to try to get to that artistic process and what is it about creativity. Of course, we could just drop all that and do what many, many people did with Marina Abramovic. She's in red. For 3 months, Marina Abramovic sat for 8 hours a day across a table from visitors who would simply look at her. And what they were trying to discern, I'm not sure, but they were trying to get into her mind, I think, and that was part of the project. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit to actually go back to the question, how do we know an artist's mind? I'm not going to look into Marina Abramovic's eyes all day long, but I do look into the eyes of this gentleman who happens to be my husband. This is David Ross in a photograph. He's looking very baby-faced about 10 years ago. And I want to talk about a very specific project for the last 5 minutes that in some ways I'm trying to reveal to you how I see an artist's mind working and how I think some of these methods and modes can actually be helpful and useful in how we think about research. So I'm going to look at David's brain in 3 minutes. He was doing another project, I won't go into that, where he was spending a lot of time in museum vaults. So this is, if any of you have been in the back rooms of museums, this is mostly what it looks like. It's pretty unsexy. He was fascinated by all of these shipping crates and the fact that many of them were painted these beautiful colors. So he started doing some research and found out that, in fact, the crates of Canada have a different color for different institutions all the way across the nation. And he thought, wow, is that just a Canadian thing? So he started to do some more research, and sure enough, it has everything to do with 1967. So at this time in Canadian history, this lovely, looking back at a time that was initially quite solemn, many cultural institutions were started. And I don't know the number, but many museums and galleries actually came into being at this time. And somebody was very smart and said, great, let's give everybody a color. So when we open up the back of a shipping truck, we can actually know whose crates are going where and where they're from. So David was intrigued by this, and he thought, 1967, well, what else is happening in Canada, or actually in North America, really, in terms of the art world? And what was happening was something called color field painting and abstract expressionism. So I think this is a shot of the Mendel Art Gallery. This on the right is a famous Barnett Newman that hangs in the National Gallery of Canada, the subject of much consternation. So color field abstract painting was really no imagery. The other thing to know about color field painting is that it was big. It was very masculine. These are Rothko paintings in the chapel in Houston, Texas. So Dave started thinking about large swaths of color, giant canvases being moved around Canada, and looked back at these crates again and thought, maybe there's some connection between these kind of color field crates and the color field paintings that they were transporting at this time. So this is how the artist's mind works. He makes this crazy kind of intuitive leap, right? Looks back at all these colors of these crates, and then he thinks to himself, well, I'm going to get me some of those crates. He then takes 2 years to contact various institutions across the land and has them send him empty shipping crates to a studio here in Montreal. And then it gets even weirder. He then sets up a whole rig because he wants to somehow find this color. So he's working with a 4x5 camera, if any of you know this. It's like the film is this big. It's a piece of film. He gets a 4x5 camera, and then he goes to a machine shop and works with somebody and makes this rig that allows him to move the camera in various ways so that he can get extremely, extremely close to about 1 millimeter away from the actual crate. And he's able to tilt it back and forth. And then this is where the improvisation part comes in. He straps on microscope lenses, essentially, onto this 4x5 camera and starts photographing at very close range the colored surfaces of the crates. The reason he's using 4x5 film is that it has tremendous abilities to actually be blown up without losing any resolution. So I want you to keep your eye on the little pink crate on the left, this blue crate here, and this yellow crate. Because this is what happened when he got very close. These incredible, almost lunar surfaces. Here's the pink crate. Here's the crazy surface of this, the CCA crate that was this blue kind of, I don't know, painted metal or plastic, I'm not sure. And then this vibrant yellow crate. So each one of those holes is actually microscopic. You can't even really see it to the naked eye. So this is what happened next. He then blew those images up to the same size as the crate which they came from and which would carry them, and installed them at the Musée d'Art Contemporain. So the reason I think this project is so interesting is that it, in a way, in a kind of snapshot, shows you this sort of intuitive connection that he made because of another series of projects. His improvisational capabilities to figure out how to get crates sent to him, building this camera, and then this kind of iterative process where he had to keep photographing and figuring out how to actually make these works into something that would coalesce his ideas. So these are 3 terms, if we can keep waking up the data projector, that I think are shared really beautifully across the arts, sciences, social sciences, engineering, are these sorts of methods. We use them differently and to different ends, but I found through a process that we're undergoing right now for the Embedded Faculty Initiative, where we're placing fine arts faculty members in laboratories across the university, that these are 3 of the main areas where we're seeing very interesting methodological connections. So thank you for letting me be able to share that with you. When intuition, improvisation, iteration come together, we have a kind of convergence, and that's exactly where we're going to take you now. In the EV building, on the 6th floor, there are about 30 or 40 students who are working together for their last evening around a terrific project called Convergence, where we've been working with artists, designers, dancers, performers from our faculty and neuroscientists in the Brain Repair and Integrative Neuroimaging Lab at McGill. I'm showing you a snapshot from the website of some of the pairings that have been made quite organically between the students. So if you will join us, and some of us will be happy guides to the 6th floor in the EV, unless we're having some kind of, we have a little Q&A, super, good. So after the Q&A, we'll be able to actually talk with the artists and the scientists about their convergence and their collaborations, and you'll get to see some of the projects that have emerged that are really this exact topic for the discussion tonight in action.
So thank you so much to the 4 presenters. I will now invite you actually to come and sit in the chair just here to receive some questions from the audience. I think there are probably a lot of questions since all the presentations were highly interested and show another engagement with between art and science. Well, I'm going to start as everybody's a little shy. So. Stephen, obviously, I have the same reaction, not the same reaction, but I'm surprised you actually came to that realization later in life that these were highly connected, the mobiles and the molecules. And then you talked a little bit about the publication that came out of that, but I'm wondering, since you've been out and kind of more in the open about these potential connections in your life between your research and your art, have other scientists reached out to you in the same kind of field, in more art, science, talking about their art practices and how they might be related?
So you're asking me if other scientists have contacted me? Not really, not really. Well, I think that it is true that these 2 realms are quite isolated. I know there are a lot of efforts to bring artists and scientists together, like the effort that you're describing right now, but I've worked among scientists for most of my life. And sure, some of them are interested in art and this and that, but there's still a lot of trepidation into sort of making the jump into the other side, right? This said, I have had colleagues, scientists, chemist colleagues who are very much into photography, very much into sort of artistic realms, but I can't think of a scientist who has come to me and asked me specifically about, getting more into art. This said, I think there's endless possibilities for the 2 realms to meet and create wonderful projects that would be interesting both from the scientific viewpoint as well as an aesthetic and artistic viewpoint.
I have a follow-up question to that. Stephen, I'm wondering, now that you've discovered the parallel processes that you have in your 2 separate careers, do you find that your practice has changed in either or both?
Yeah, I guess in an extreme way it has, because I no longer do research in chemistry, so it basically ended one sort of stream so that I could focus on full-time on visual art. This said, I mean, I think when you're a scientist for 30 years, you're a scientist for life, right? You just start expressing that scientific curiosity in different ways and maybe in different directions, right?
So My question is for Mr. Roy. I have a personal interest in cognitive systems and artificial intelligence, and that analysis that you mentioned where pixels and whatnot would lead to a similar curve to turbulence. How are you perceiving that this could not be just a random similarity? There is this website that compares graphs where you show the amount of movies by Nicolas Cage rises it's the same rate as a suicide for a certain amount of years. This is just random. So, I mean, while I do find the interest of linking those to art awesome, how are you preventing in a perception making that false analogy?
Well, this is an interesting question, because one of the conclusions that the physicists who actually done the analysis didn't carry forward. They didn't say, they sort of made I'd say an analogy between the state of mind of one painter, and talking about the mind of the artist, and turbulent signal. The fact, though, is that they've tried it with many different other people, and there's only one that sort of came out. But if you look at the field of psychology and psychiatry, turbulence is now being used quite a bit in terms of trying to use it perhaps as a metaphoric kind of aspect to how the mind works, but also in terms of going deeper in terms of what it expresses, right? So, yes, there might be some kind of weird connection, but it's very difficult to generate a turbulent signal. It's very, very difficult. I've known some artists, like musicians, trying to use turbulence pulses and try to generate music. It's very difficult. Metaphorically, it's easy, but in terms of getting the right signal, in terms of the quantitative kind of aspects to it, that Kolmogorov without, as the cascade of energy would be expressed by his mathematics, it's extremely difficult. So it might be a coincidence, but I doubt it is, because of the difficulty of creating real turbulent signals as we know them from physics and mathematics.
I have another question for Dean Duclos. The question is basically, a lot of us might have that question. So when we try to teach students about research, it's really hard to get them to see the part that is improvisation, and to get them to see this as a creative process. So I'm wondering, it's a question for you, but it's, I guess, a question for all of you as well. How do we convey that part of the research process for people that might see art as something that is a little free-for-all and not necessarily something that is in the same path as research?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there are a couple of different answers, and then I'll give an example. One thing is to really think about what open-ended research looks like. I mean, oftentimes we have set outcomes that we need to meet, or that we're going to predict that we'll meet, and already we're setting ourselves in place. So I think that's, again, one of the distinguishing features of the arts, is that they often have an open-ended process at play. But sometimes we actually have to create conditions to give that permission. And I'll give you an example of a really interesting project that's happened numerous times in numerous venues. It's called a bibliodérive. So it draws on the concept of the dérive, or the drift, from the Situationists. They were a group of radical urbanists in the 1950s. And the notion for them is that they would allow themselves to just follow the kind of ambiances and currents of desire in a city. So rather than following the correct street and pathways, they would allow themselves to go down alleyways or across fields and so forth. We brought that concept of the dérive in a city into libraries as cities of books. And in a bibliodérive, it can last for an hour to 5 hours, 5 days. You encourage students to actually just let themselves respond to the library's physical currents, its emotional currents, as well as even the colors of spines of books, so that they're not thinking at first about the information, or about trying to connect all of these dots to produce something literate. And it's amazing what they'll end up finding. And oftentimes there's an uncanny situation where at the end of a couple of hours of deriving through a library, what will happen is a person will actually get to a topic that they had been thinking about or had always wanted to look up and had never done so before. So it's almost as if the unconscious mind brings them to a certain place and they discover all of these other potential research currents along the way. So sometimes we actually have to create an exercise that allows that to happen.
Well, perhaps on the same theme, it's about improvisation when we experiment in science. And sometimes you plan the experiment, but you add something to it that's a bit like, the random thought saying. And in the field of turbulence, what happens is sometimes you're looking at an experiment and you're seeing things, and then you just throw in something else in it, and it transforms the whole way of looking at it, and it asks you questions that you've never asked yourself before, along the same lines of changing your route or going into places that you've never seen before. And I'll just give an example of one thing that happened is that I was working with a friend at the University of Leeds, and we're doing an experiment. And we created a situation that what we were seeing we'd never seen before, ever. And we didn't even add the words. We didn't add the words. We just didn't know what we were looking at. So we took a whole bunch of pictures and films and in order to generate so that we could go back to it like months later and try to figure out what have we seen, right? But it was totally improvisation in some ways, and then you get into trying to get at the meaning of it, which was quite the fun part of science, right? So
I feel like an imposter because I don't make art, but I really like art, and I seem to attract a lot of artistic and creative students. And one of the things that I've noticed as I'm a historian is the actual process of making an object, the things you can learn that you wouldn't know. So the best example I have for this is I work a lot on clothing and hair styles in antiquity, and of course sculpture always presents that. And I have written, and many of us have written things like, oh, you would need many slaves, many hours to reconstruct these hairstyles. So a student sent me a link and said, did you know there's a stylist who is in Baltimore? She's near Johns Hopkins. She went to the museum. She reconstructed all these hairstyles. She's reconstructed the hairstyle of the Vestal Virgins. And she did it in 30 minutes. We didn't know how to do this. So anyway, we happened to have a conference in Baltimore. I scraped together a little bit of money, and she came, Janet Stevens, and she did hair, and she explained the art of Roman hairstyle, and she showed us how they did it, and they braided and sewed hair. So she calls herself, I don't know, an experimental archaeologist. Like she could have created, she's an artist, right? She understands how hair works, what it can do, how it moves from practice. And she had so much to teach us as historians. So I think it's the intuitive process. There's things that are learned in the process of making something.
Could I add something to that? I think I didn't answer the first question entirely. I guess when you asked me about whether scientists have approached me, I kind of thought chemists because I'm so kind of chemocentric. But actually last year, a biologist came to my studio and we saw the mobiles. Right away, he said, these are phylogenetic trees in 3 dimensions, right? And this actually overlaps with an idea I had of making sort of like family trees, mom, dad, and the kids in a mobile. But he was interested because if there are any biologists in the audience, that normally phylogenetic trees, the relationships between species and genera and et cetera, are all 2-dimensional. But that's not a very good representation of the evolutionary links between the different species. It's much better represented in 3-dimension, and that's why he says, we got to do this. We got to actually make a 3-dimensional phylogenetic tree physically and hang, the biological specimens. So this is a project that hopefully one day will happen. I just got to stop thinking like a chemist and maybe more like a biologist.
And maybe a last question for all of us. Dean Duclos has started to talk a little bit about it, but what would be the kind of spaces or conditions to create more of these linkages, right? So we have one convergence, and we're going to meet with them just after the discussion. But what else could we think in terms of in somebody that's left science, somebody that's still some of you that are still in science as well? What are the ways we could set up a more robust dialogue between these two spaces?
Right. I can try start something. Don't look at the deans. We're just professors.
What can we do?
What can we do? No, I'll just start. It's like the idea of trying to stir things up a little bit in terms of those connections. And I, for one, if I go back to, for instance, Faulkner's quote, right? I think the way that this quote could only come is that the person stood in water. The person was immersed in some kind of fluid in order to come up with it. And it needs a sense of observation. As a geographer and doing lots of field work, it's a really critical thing. And you've got to immerse yourself in something. And it's not just with your mind that you're actually understanding it as a rational kind of thing. It's also as you engage more fully with your body or your senses. And that can create a stronger sense of understanding as you go from feeling and sort of creating a different set of parameters through which you analyze the situation, which gets you into more creativity and perhaps more of the sort of art piece of sort of seeing something aesthetic, or do you want to understand with different words. So I think we have to encourage our students to experiment in that kind of mindset of being able to bridge things in a different way. And as a geographer, we do that when we go in nature, and so it's one thing that's quite fun to do.
Sure, if I may. I'm drawing from what artists often do. There are a few methods. One is setting up kind of almost experimental conditions for oneself. So artists often use exercises, right? It's either you have 5 minutes and 5 dancers and you have to come up with a choreography, or you have 5 people, there's a canvas and you have to make a mark, each of you. So one idea would be for us to set up experimental conditions where we would meet each other. And I guess I'm also thinking of that contact improv. What happens if we have conceptual contact improv where we have members from various different disciplines in a room together, and we actually give ourselves exercises to see what happens. Another model that often is used in the art world are artist residencies, where an artist will go somewhere else and have a retreat and make work, and the conditions are such that the creative practice can really flow. What happens if we can think about these kind of micro-residencies where we can spend time with each other and in each other's spaces, learning each other's languages, not mastering them, and not, no grand, money is involved. It's just getting to know one another. So how can we have these kind of micro-residencies? And I guess the last method that is often used in the arts, and I'm sure everywhere else, is collaboration. So, what does it mean for us to actually plan a project together and try to work together across fields or across disciplines? But I think each of those does require, to Mireille's point, a kind of instigation or a tilled field for the seeds to be planted and then to grow. We can hope that students will find each other. We can hope that faculty will want to work with one another. But we all have busy lives and curriculum and degrees and so forth and research. So I think the university can actually take steps, pretty small ones actually, that might start to instigate some of these relationships.
I guess since we're at a educational institution, I think one thing that would help a great deal as well is if fine art students are encouraged to take basic science courses to have a certain level of scientific literacy to allow them to participate in art science projects, and vice versa as well, encouraging people who are majoring in scientific disciplines to take courses, since you have such a large and vibrant fine arts department here. I did most of my education at McGill, and there it's completely different. I still managed to find a pottery course here and a drawing course here, but it's very different here, where you have so much possibilities of having students explore outside their majors in a very big way.
Last question. Yes.
I sort of would like to follow up to what you just said. I'm in a fine arts department, mostly computation arts and interactive robotics and whatnot. There is, however, a big wall going to science classes. I've dropped mathematics in high school. So doing Fourier transfers and whatnot that is necessary for interactive music requires me to take a full year of mathematics before even getting to discrete music. And that is not really easy to just experiment and try, like, let's plan a full year of classes for experimentation that I may not like. So you're like, yes, I would like to go to science, but I can't use it in the environment that is supposed to help me experiment into this. And having those common spaces are also usually restricted to grad students. So while we're undergrads, I mean, I may not look it, but I am, there are quite a lot of places that we have no idea exist because they're like reserved for specific people or hidden away for all sorts of political and understandable reasons. So yes, I agree we could have those spaces, but we should know of them, not just, you know, special faculty members or grad students. Even if it's just like, yes, I'll be moving cables for grad students, you can just be part of the project. Whereas if you need all those prerequisites just to try help out an attempt, that's not gonna happen. And that's what's currently happening from my experience in the arts and trying to go into much more, you know, science-oriented arts because of the limitations.
One quick thing I'll say is that as André will know, the university, we're looking at using our summers better, and we're really thinking about summer courses, and in that thinking is this idea of micro schools or crash courses. And I guess maybe it's my own thinking, but I would love to imagine that we could have crash courses that are, you know, 1 credit or 1.5, where you know, a sculptor could learn basic electronics, a person from chemistry could learn simple computation methods for electric music or electronic music. We could, so there would be almost like these kind of exposure classes where you wouldn't get the full deal, but instead of having to go into an advanced math class for an entire year, you might be able to just get a kind of taste of things, and it could go both ways. So I don't know, maybe that's something that we can look at as these kind of cross-disciplinary crash courses in a way.
Thank you so much to the 4 presenters for their intervention. It was so wonderful to learn about the connections between arts and research in your work. I've learned a lot, and it's really fascinating. So I propose a round of applause, but please don't leave after. Yes.